Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 2, the story of Israel against Judah, as these tribes go to war. First Samuel is the story of the rise and fall of Saul. Now as we come to 2 Samuel, that's going to be the story of the rise and fall of David. And these two stories are going to be told in parallel. That is, in 1 Samuel, you started off with the birth of Samuel. 2 Samuel starts off not with the birth, but with the death of Saul. 1 Samuel, after the birth of Saul, you have Hannah's song of thanksgiving. She's rejoicing, giving thanks for the birth of that baby. In 2 Samuel, you have David's song of lament, his song of the bow, as he's singing a lament over the death of Saul, his king, and Jonathan, the son of the king, David's dear friend. In 1 Samuel, next you hear the story of how Samuel hears the voice of God. That's actually what the name Samuel means. It means the one who hears God. In 2 Samuel, we read of David, how he listens to God's instruction. So let's dig in. 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1, and then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? Prior to this, he'd been living in Ziklag, a Philistine city that has now become the property of Judah. And the Lord said to him, go up. So, we read the rest of verse 1, so David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Now, Hebron is a city probably about 15 miles or so south of Jerusalem. It's up on the mountain range. This had been the place where Abraham had been buried. We'll say more about that later. Verse 2, so David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. We saw back in 1 Samuel how he had married these women. Verse 3, and David brought up with his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. So David relocates to the town of Hebron. Verse 4, then the men of Judah came, and there anointed David king over the house of Judah. So David will be the tribal leader. We're going to use the word king here, but don't think king in a palace. Remember how we saw back in 1 Samuel, Saul had been anointed as king, but he had been sort of a farmer king. He still went out and plowed his field, and it was not like he was sitting in a palace with all these servants to come and serve him. David is king over the house of Judah, but that's really sort of a farmer king sort of thing. He's more of we would think of it as a tribal leader. Rest of verse 4, and they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. Now remember, Jabesh Gilead had been the city that Saul had rescued right at the beginning of Saul's kingship. They had been under threat from the Ammonites who had threatened to overwhelm them, and they had said to the Ammonites, we give up. And the king of Ammon had said, fine, you can give up, but I'm going to gouge out the right eye of every man among you. And they had said, well, maybe we won't give up. Somebody come help us. And it had been Saul who came and had delivered them. And now when Saul had died and his body had been mutilated by the Philistines, it had been the men of Jabesh Gilead who had gone and fetched the body of Saul and had brought it back to Jabesh Gilead and given it a decent and honorable burial. Well, verse 5, David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord and have buried him. Now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I will also show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Verse 7, so now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant. He's putting a blessing upon them. For Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. He's letting them know, yes, I've been anointed king over part of Saul's previous kingdom, over the house of Judah, but I'm not doing this in rebellion. I'm thinking well of Saul, but they have anointed me as king, and so he's bringing them up to speed on what's taken place. Verse 8, but Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and had brought him over to Mahanaim. Now, Mahanaim, we don't know exactly where that's located, but it seems to be on the east side of the Jordan River, maybe somewhere around the Jabbok River. Now, what we have here is a sort of a family line, a family tree showing Saul, Notice it starts with Abiel and then down the left side, Kish and then Saul. And then Saul had 4 sons, but most of the sons had died in battle. But one of his sons had survived. He's called here Ishbosheth. When we get to Chronicles, he's given the name Ishbaal. 2 different names, same person. Ishbosheth means man. Actually, literally, it means man of shame. I'm not sure. Maybe it had a different connotation back then. That's sort of an odd name that somebody would have. But notice that Saul, and then on the right side of this family tree, you have Saul's cousin, his cousin Abner. And so Saul is dead, and so Abner now backs his nephew, Ishbosheth. I'm not sure that it's because he thinks that Ishbosheth is so wonderful, but rather I have a sneaking suspicion that there is at least an ulterior motive, and that ulterior motive is that Abner is going to be the uncle of the next king, and that will make him kingmaker, and it will give him authority, and it will, after all, he's got a vested interest in seeing that Saul's line still holds the kingship. Well, verse 9, he made him king, that is Ishbosheth, he made him king over Gilead. And then we're, notice Gilead's that area on the east side of the Jordan, but also over the Asherites, that's a tribe to the north, over Jezreel, that's a city in the valley of Jezreel, over Ephraim, a large tribe, over Benjamin, and then really even over all Israel, except for Judah. So Judah has recognized David as king, but the other tribes now, some are mentioned, some are sort of passed over, but the other tribes have now recognized Ishbosheth, and Abner being the sort of the one that's pulling the strings, but they've recognized Ishbosheth as the king. Verse 10, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. So you have part of the tribes, the tribe of Judah following David. The other tribes are following Ishbosheth. Verse 11, the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So notice we're not rounding it after the year now. We're getting rather exact. Verse 13, and Joab, now Joab was David's relative, and Joab is David's right-hand man in the same way that Abner has become the right-hand man first of Saul and now of Ishbosheth. Well, Joab, the son of Zeruiah and the servants of David, went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. Remember how Gibeon was that city that had surrendered to Joshua when the Israelites first came into the land, but they did it by subterfuge. They did it by pretending they were far away, and they entered into a covenant with Joshua. Joshua didn't realize they were just over the next hill. And Joshua had honored the agreement, and the men of Gibeon now, even though a number of them were Canaanites, they had been allowed to remain in the land. Well, there's a pool there. I'm assuming it's the same pool that we're looking at. Maybe it was a different, because things, remember, change over thousands of years. But this is an ancient pool, and what you would do is you'd dig the well down, and then you'd have a stairway leading way down into it. And hopefully this would be within the city walls. Well, there was a pool there at Gibeon, and they sat down, and notice Joab is there with some of the servants of David there, but also there's going to be some other people. They sat down, one on the one side of the pool, and the other on the other side of the pool. And Abner is there with representatives of Ishbosheth, and Abner said to Joab, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. Now, when he says contest, it sounds a little bit like, well, gee, maybe they're going to play football or something like that. I don't think it's that kind of contest. I think it's going to be a contest of arms, a contest of fighting, and I'm not sure if the intent is to fighting to the death, but that's what they're going to do. It's a little bit like calling David and Goliath a contest. I think it's that sort of thing. Now, it's not just going to be one champion against another, but it will be a number of champions against a number of other champions. And so this contest they'll enter into that. And Joab said, let them arise. So verse 15, so they arose and went over by count, 12 for Benjamin, and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. So it's supposed to be sort of lined up evenly. Verse 16, each one of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So this is armed combat, And so they fell down together, and therefore that place was called Helkath HaZarim, which is in Gibeon. Now that term there, Helkath, that's the Helkath is the word division, or sometimes you know how you divide up the spoil, and then Hazarim is the plural. It's the cliffs or the rocks, you know, the division by the rocks or something like that. Or I guess if you wanted to say, maybe you could say division on the rocks, but that sounds sort of crass. So this is going to be a place that gets a place name because of this event. Verse 17, that day the battle was very severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Verse 18, now the three sons of Zeruiah were there. We mentioned Joab, but Joab and Abishai and Asahel. So you have David, his nephew is Joab. David has a brother named Zeruiah, and Joab is one of the sons of that brother. So you have Joab, probably the oldest. Joab's going to be David's right-hand man. You also have Abishai. Abishai had been with David in a lot of places back in 1 Samuel. Remember how David had snuck into the camp of Saul when Saul was asleep and took his water pot and later on said, see, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Abishai had been the one that had been with David on that instance. But now we have what I'm going to assume is the youngest. He's certainly the fastest, and that's Asahel. And Asahel, maybe he hadn't, maybe he's the youngest and maybe he hadn't quite, gotten into the action of some of those previous stories, and he wants to sort of make up for it now. And he's as swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. Whereas maybe Joab and Abishai had their share of donuts, not so with Asahel. He can run really fast, and that's going to play a part in our story. Verse 19, Asahel pursued Abner and did not turn to the right or to the left from following Abner. And Abner looked behind him as this guy just won't give up and said, is that you, Asahel? And he said, it is I. Verse 21, so Abner said to him, turn to your right or to your left and take hold of one of the young men for yourself and take yourself some of his spoil. Stop chasing me. Go pick up some of the things that have been dropped by other people. But Asahel was not willing to turn aside from following him. And furthermore, he's a fast runner. Verse 22, Abner repeated again to Asahel, turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab? Verse 23, however, he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the belly with the butt end of the spear. Now, that's sort of unusual if it's translated correctly. But notice he hits him with a spear so that the spear came out at his back. This is clearly a mortal wound. And he fell there and died on the spot. And it came about that all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. Verse 24, but Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which is in front of Giah by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon, probably running toward the east. When you say the wilderness, and you're in that mountain range, when you go to the east, you come to the wilderness area, the area where it doesn't get a lot of rainfall, and quite frankly, it's sort of barren and ugly and rocky and looks like a desert, only it's slanted down toward the Jordan Rift Valley. Verse 25, the sons of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became one band. And so they've regathered there, and Joab and his brother have been chasing Abner, but now he's got some backup here, and they stood on the top of a certain hill. Verse 26, then Abner called to Joab and said, shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers? Enough already. Give it up. It's time to end the bloodshed. Verse 27, Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother. So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. And finally, there is a halt to the bloodshed. Verse 29, Abner and his men went through the Arabah all that night. So they crossed the Jordan and walked all the morning and came to Mahanaim. Again, we're not sure exactly where it is. Probably it's on the east side of the Jordan, probably around the Jabbok River there. Verse 30, then Joab returned from following Abner when he had gathered all the people together. 19 of David's servants besides Asahel were missing, so they'd lost some people. Verse 31, but the servants of David had struck down many of the Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men had died. So the amount of losses was much greater on the side of Benjamin. Now remember that, because that's going to come back in just a second. We're going to reflect on that in a minute. Verse 32, and they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which is in Bethlehem. And then Joab and his men went all night until the day dawned at Hebron. But notice the reference to Bethlehem. I think that is significant. After all, this is where David is from. His family is from Bethlehem. But this also reminds us of two stories. You see, Bethlehem has not been mentioned a lot so far in the Bible. It was the scene of the story of Ruth, but before Ruth, we had seen it in two stories that were at the end of the book of Judges, two very bitter stories, two bad stories, where bad things had taken place. And in one of those stories especially, it had led to some events that had resulted in war between tribes of Israel and other tribes, and Benjamin had been involved in that. Of course, back then, in that time, Benjamin had been reduced almost to non-existence with a story that had started in Bethlehem. And again, here is another story where Benjamin suffers great loss, and there's loss on both sides, but Benjamin had suffered great loss. And the story brings us back to Bethlehem. And it reminds us of the refrain that we saw at the end of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the point is, they need the king, but not King Saul. They need the king from Bethlehem. And we need the king from Bethlehem too, because we have a greater king from Bethlehem. We have King Jesus. And we need the king from Bethlehem.